but there wasn't the money for a new one. There wasn't any money at all. Will hadn't thought about that when he left. Hadn't thought she'd have to spend to have the wood chopped and be cheated at that. Eliza had had to scrimp to purchase the thread she sewed with, and was quick to save the basting strands to be reused in the quilting. Still, she was one of the lucky ones among the war widows, as the women whose men were away fighting for the Union called themselves. Her harvest was in, and there was enough to last through the winter if they were frugal. The potatoes were dug, the corn in the crib, the apples dried or pressed into cider. The costly woodpile was high, and the house snug. She was blessed, too, because there were no small children underfoot. Her two, Davy, 14, and Luzina, 12, were old enough to be a help to her after their lessons at the table were done. Her son did the work of a man, while her daughter tended the house so that Eliza could work the fields with Davy. Together they had brought in the harvest as best they could, with much of it going to men who had helped on shares, and jayhawked her, she suspected. But at least there was enough to tide them over until the following year. Eliza had everything she needed, except Will. But he would come back. Just a few months ago, in the late summer of 1864, he had gone for a soldier, a member of the Kansas Volunteers, to preserve the Union and free the slaves. But he would come back. He had promised. Until then, Eliza would manage. Just as the sun sank below the horizon, Eliza bit off the last bit of thread, muttered, "Done," and held up the quilt for inspection. She was not given to self-praise, but she had to admit it was as fine a quilt as she had ever made, which meant it might be the finest in Waubonsee County, Kansas. Eliza would not say she was the best quilter for miles around, but others would. She looked for imperfections but could not see them. Maybe that was not due to her fine sewing, but because the dark had come on. She had wanted to make the quilt with hearts and flowers to remind Will of the farm and let him know how much he was loved. But Eliza thought such a quilt might embarrass him among the soldiers. So she had chosen a stars and stripes quilt, one she had seen in Peterson's magazine. The magazine was old, had been published in 1861, before the war began, and she hadn't seen it until the copy came around to her 3 years later. But the moment she saw it, she knew she had to make the quilt for Will. The magazine pattern was in color, hand-tinted with bright red and blue. The quilt was not exactly a flag, but inspired by the flag. A background of red and white stripes with a border of white stars on blue, and a star-filled blue triangle in the center. She hadn't made the quilt exactly like the pattern. What woman didn't want to bring her own creativity to a quilt? Besides, she'd wanted to make a small quilt, one that was the size of a hired man's comfort, because a full-sized quilt would be large and too heavy for a bedroll. She knew the white would get dirty. Will had written that the soldiers slept on the ground, and when they found tents, the accommodations weren't clean. They sat on their blankets to eat and clean their guns, to read the Bible and play cards. But if the quilts were to be patterned after the Union flag, it had to have the white stripes. With winter coming, Eliza had worried that Will would take cold. The blankets issued to the soldiers, he had written, weren't much better than shoddy, sold to the War Department by a contractor who was more interested in profit than in providing warm bedding for the army. After reading the letter, Eliza knew she had to make her husband a quilt, and by chance, she had seen the copy of Peterson's magazine. The coincidence seemed fortuitous. At first, she had thought she would line the quilt with wool. She would procure it from a neighbor who raised sheep, trading with him for a bushel or two of corn. The wool would be warmer than cotton. But then she thought down would be even warmer and not weigh so much. She'd never heard of anyone using down for batting, but it would be soft and lightweight, too. So she killed and plucked the ducks and made the case of muslin the size of the quilt top, quilted it to keep the down.